Welcome, everybody, to this special presentation we have for you today. My name is Jose Zuniga. I am an educator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and I will be your virtual host this morning. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Stonehenge Beyond the Mystery. Now, we have a wonderful presentation for you today, and you will probably have questions and comments that will occur to you as the presentation is going on. You can post those into the chat. I will monitor the chat, even though you may not be able to see it. I can see it, and after the presentation, we'll have time for Q&A. If you are worried about your question not getting answered, don't panic about that, and please, for my own sake, just post your question once. Trust me, I am keeping an eye on it. I know that sometimes when we're eager to have a question answered, we like to post it more than once, but that makes the chat very crowded. So if you could only post this question once, I would greatly appreciate it. With all of that stuff out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Michael Parker Pearson. Dr. Parker Pearson is a professor of British Later Prehistory at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London. He has been directing research on Stonehenge since 2003 and is the curator for the traveling exhibition Stonehenge Ancient Mysteries and Modern Discoveries, which is currently at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Parker Pearson.
Atul, it's a pleasure. And thank you everybody for getting up early in the morning, I think, because it's 4 o'clock here in the UK. So I've had a nice leisurely day. So that's very kind of you all to come and join at this time. So I will load, there we go. I will load up my PowerPoint. And there we are. And share that with everybody. Okay. Yeah. Great. Yes. So Stonehenge Beyond the Mystery. Now, I've been working on Stonehenge for, it's nearly 2 decades. We first started digging in 2004, and we had some fairly simple ideas, which normally, when an archaeologist sticks a spade in the ground, all of his hypotheses and theories evaporate as he discovers that it's actually nothing like how it was thought to be. So it's been a real roller coaster of a ride, because every time we found something that led us in a further direction, it was kind of following a ball of string. We never knew quite where it was going to go. And here we are 2 decades later, and we're still following up that research. And I'm right now getting ready to go out in the field because of what may be exciting new discoveries a long way from Stonehenge in West Wales, where some of its stones originated. But let's begin at the beginning. It was, over 300 years ago that antiquarians, sort of early form of archaeologists really, wondered what Stonehenge might actually have been for. And it was the 2 antiquarians, John Aubrey, followed by William Stukely, in the 17th and 18th centuries, who worked out that Stonehenge was prehistoric. But of course, their only guide to prehistory what was written down by the classical authors like Julius Caesar. Caesar, of course, had invaded Britain twice, 55, 54 BC. And he wrote about the religious side of life as well as the military, and recorded the fact that there were Druids. Stukely had looked at the shape of Stonehenge, and Aubrey as well, and they assumed that it was some kind of temple. It reminded them of the temples of the Greco-Roman world in the Mediterranean. And that idea that it was a temple, they latched on to, what have we got from prehistory? We've just got what Caesar tells us, that the priests were called Druids. So that's how the association between Druids and Stonehenge developed. And today there's actually a religion of Druids, many different groups of them. I think in the last population census, there was something like 4,000 people who registered their religion as Druid. So they've adopted Stonehenge as their temple, but archaeologists really, as early as the beginning of the 20th century, were never really convinced that Druids had anything to do with Stonehenge. And of course, what Stukely and Aubrey could not have known was just how ancient Stonehenge was, even in Julius Caesar's time, that it was 2,500 years before the Druids that Caesar was writing about. In the 1960s, an American astronomer, Gerald Hawkins, came up with the idea that Stonehenge was an observatory or maybe a calendar to actually mark particular solar and lunar events, including eclipses. And he showed how this was possible, that you could actually calculate from the various settings of the monument. Since then, astronomers have taken a rather more parsimonious view, and we work with one of the top names in the business, Professor Clive Ruggles. He's been working in Hawaii, incidentally, but Clive in particular has been able to really refine down some of those wilder claims to say, well, actually, there are just a few things we can be sure of about the lunar and solar alignments at Stonehenge. The most important one is this axis on the midsummer sunrise to the northeast, and in the opposite direction at 180 degrees to the southwest is the midwinter solstice sunset. There are other directions, other alignments on aspects to do with the maximum moonrise and moonset that I won't go into. But Clive's view is that we've got to remember that these directions are not actually precisely marked at Stonehenge. And his view is that Stonehenge isn't actually an observatory. It's more that this is actually a monument to these eternal cycles of the sun and the moon, that they're symbolic rather than actually practical. That hasn't stopped people having all sorts of wonderful ideas to do with aliens. I received a letter some years ago from someone explaining that, in fact, Stonehenge was built the shape it was because an intergalactic starfighter had to crash land to be repaired because parts of its undercarriage had been shot away. So there are many theories, some less plausible, but perhaps more exciting than archaeologists' ideas. My own involvement with Stonehenge began as a result of working in Madagascar, pretty much on the other side of the world. And it was there that I was able to work with archaeologist Ramili Sonina, who's actually from a family that puts up megalithic monuments. And we were studying megalith building in contemporary Madagascar. So I was particularly interested when he came to the UK to see what his take on Stonehenge would be. And he said, well, Mike, we've been working together on megaliths in Madagascar. How come you don't know what Stonehenge is for? Because isn't it blindingly obvious that it's like Madagascar, where we build in stone for the ancestors because they are permanent and eternal, like the cycling of the sun and the moon. Whereas for the living, life is transient. We are only here for a short time. So traditionally in Madagascar, we build our houses out of wood and other perishable materials. And this got me thinking, because we knew that we'd known for some time as archaeologists in Britain that just a short distance up the River Avon from Stonehenge was a group of timber circles, formerly timber circles, obviously long ago rotted away. The most well-known of these is Woodhenge, but there were another two inside the huge henge of Darrington Walls. And you can see on this map here, where Darrington Walls is sited. And what we did was to suggest that maybe we could see Stonehenge as part of a larger complex, that we had an area around Stonehenge that we labeled the domain of the ancestors, including Stonehenge itself, and similarly an area around Darrington Walls and Woodhenge that was a domain of the living, and that the river acted as the kind of the connector, but also the divider, the kind of river that divided the underworld from the world of the living. So this was the theory that got me going. And in 2003, we started on our project because what we wanted to look at was the relationship to these two complexes to each other and to the river. So we called it the Stonehenge Riverside Project. And here's everybody on the team. I realized that this was going to be such a huge undertaking that I needed to work with a team of like-minded specialists, other professors of archaeology, and the Stonehenge Riverside Project was born. That morphed into a new project, Feeding Stonehenge, because from all the finds that we accumulated, we realized that we could actually look at the resourcing of Stonehenge. Where had people come from? What had they required for the subsistence practices? You know, if you're going to put up a big monument, you've really got to make sure you've got a good crew making the sandwiches for you. And then that developed into the project we're on at the moment, the Stones of Stonehenge project, to investigate the origins of Stonehenge's stones, particularly the ones that we now know come all the way from Wales. So I bet you're all really excited about chronology and love learning dates. So we'll start off with this just to get ourselves fixed in time. And we're looking at the transition from the time of the first farmers in Britain through to the Bronze Age, when people were using tools and weapons made of bronze. And Stonehenge basically straddles that transition. So the first farmers arrived in Britain somewhere around 6,000 years ago. So we say 4,000 BC, to replace the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers that were living in these islands. But it's 1,000 years after that, around 3000 BC, that the first of 5 stages at Stonehenge was constructed. And those 5 stages basically span the transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age. And within that, we're recognizing a very short Copper Age before people learned to mix tin with their copper as an alloy of bronze. So the key dates really 3000 BC and then 2500 BC, which is when the second stage of Stonehenge, the stage that approximates pretty much to what we see today, when those huge great stones went up. We've known for centuries that Stonehenge was not sat in isolation. I've already mentioned the relationship with the timber circles at Darrington Walls and Woodhenge, but it was already located in an ancient landscape where burial mounds littered the area around. And also we have these 2 very curious long monuments called the Greater Cursus and the Lesser Cursus, which were built 500 years before the first Stonehenge. So we know that this was a landscape that was already heavily invested in ceremony and monumentality even before Stonehenge was built. That first Stonehenge was a relatively simple and small scale affair in that it's a big circular ditch and bank, and it's where we use our word henge as archaeologists to mean a bank and ditch. Normally it's where the ditch is actually inside the bank, as if you're trying to keep people out. But actually Stonehenge's bank and ditch are of a different sort, where the bank is on the inside of the ditch, as if you're trying to, as if you're trying to keep people out rather than keep something in. And although of course the term henge comes from the old Saxon word for hanging, And we think that it may have been considered as some kind of ancient gallows. At least that's how people might have interpreted it around 1500 years ago. So that first stage of Stonehenge had a series of pits known as the Aubrey holes, forming a circle just inside the bank and ditch. You can see them on this plan. And what we were able to work out was that they had actually once held standing stones that had been removed. And more than that, that they were the Welsh stones, the ones that we call blue stones. We also investigated the approach to Stonehenge, what's known as the avenue, and the first 500 meters of this is aligned on the solstice axis. So where we're looking towards the southwest here, we're looking through the center of the monument to the horizon where the sun rises at midwinter's day, on the midwinter solstice, the shortest day of the year. And the direction, of course, if we were to turn around 180 degrees, we're looking down the avenue towards midsummer sunrise. We excavated a strip across this avenue, and we discovered that actually underneath there was an earlier landform, an earlier feature on this same solstice axis. And what was surprising for us was to discover that it is in fact a natural landform, which is entirely coincidentally aligned on the axis. It consists of two low chalk ridges, and in between them a series of gullies, which are periglacial fissures formed in a previous ice age. So these fissures, you can find them all over Salisbury Plain and other areas of chalkland, but they're rarely so wide and so deep. And with the added factor that these would have actually been relatively visible in the shallow soil and low grass conditions of 6,000 years ago. So what we think is, 5,000 years ago, I should say. So what we think we're looking at is that Neolithic people saw this mark in the land, and at the end of it is where they put Stonehenge, at the southwest end of it. So we suspect that they were effectively investing it with supernatural significance, that this was a place where the earth and the heavens were in some kind of cosmic harmony. And it may well be that this is the very reason why Stonehenge was located exactly where it is. And we know that they were well aware of this natural feature, because when they cut the outer ditches for the Stonehenge Avenue, they did so that they were on the precise edges of these two parallel ridges. We also discovered that after the avenue takes its bend and then heads down to the river, where it reaches the river, it actually stopped at another stone circle, one that we only found in 2009, and that this, from the shapes of the holes and from the impressions of the stones that had formerly stood in them, we could tell that these were not local stones, but the Welsh blue stones. So we called it Blue Stonehenge. And we realized that, of course, Stonehenge was basically a two-monument complex, and that these stones were later pulled out somewhere around 2300 BC, and most likely taken up the avenue and reset in a similar 10-meter diameter circle within the middle of Stonehenge. And it was in Stonehenge itself that Neolithic people buried their dead in some numbers. In fact, it is the largest Neolithic burial ground anywhere in Britain, the biggest cemetery in the whole of the 3rd millennium BC. We know a lot about who they were and the diseases they suffered. They had a lot of arthritis, osteoarthritis and periostitis, intervertebral disc disease as well, it was a hard life in the Neolithic, whether you were pulling big stones or not. We were also able to find out a bit more about who they were. And they were mostly adults. There were very few subadults or children. So, and what was particularly interesting was that they were mostly women. Now, this is quite unusual for the Neolithic. And in the earlier part of the Neolithic, the burial record is dominated by the graves of men in collective tombs that we call long barrows. But our osteologist, Christy Willis, who did the analysis of all the cremated remains from Stonehenge, about 500,000 fragments, she also looked at the wider picture throughout Britain and found that this was absolutely typical, that it was a period where women not only were more regularly represented in funerary rites, but also particularly in association with monuments. We're looking at a very different relationship to the earlier Neolithic, one where women were clearly of greater value in society than the menfolk, though this was to change around 2500 BC, as I'll explain later, when we saw the arrival of new groups from the continent, groups that we know today that we call them the Beaker people. More about that later. But what was important for us was to get some radiocarbon dates and to discover that the cemetery had been in use for the better part of 600 years, and that there were people buried right from the beginning of Stonehenge from around 3000 BC. And then 500 years later, around 2500, we see the monument taking on its monumental form with these huge Sarson stones. Sarson is the local stone. It's a kind of sandstone. Technically, it's what geologists call a silcrete. And these are not so exotic. They haven't come from as far away, anything like as far away as the bluestones in Wales, but it's all the same. They're not from the immediate vicinity of Stonehenge. In that second stage, that was when Darrington Walls was inhabited as a settlement before the great henge around Darrington Walls and the henge around Woodhenge were constructed. The henge itself is, let's see, in metric terms, it's about 440 meters across. I think that's something like 1,600 feet. And what we discovered was that there'd been a settlement in that area underneath, before the henge was constructed, this great internal ditch and external bank. And we can date that event quite closely. We know that the settlement was inhabited around 2500 for about 45 years, well, less than 45 years. And then it was abandoned so they could build the ditch and the bank somewhere around 2450 BC. We discovered beautiful preservation. 6 inches below the turf, we found that we were on the Neolithic ground surface. So there's me, where people would have walked exactly 4,500 years before. And that meant that we actually had not just the floors of the houses, and you can see these rectangular, these square patches of white plaster with the kind of fried egg center, sunny side up, which is the hearth, the fireplace in the middle of the house. They're quite small. They're just over 5 meters by 5 meters square. And there's some reconstruction drawings for you to look at as to how they might have looked. And we discovered that we had the actual debris of everyday life indoors lying about on the floors themselves. A remarkably lucky discovery, because normally in Britain, all of this sort of this surface layer, if you like, has been long ploughed away. And it was thanks to the protection by the bank of the henge constructed and the spreading of that bank that had preserved this Neolithic ground surface. But it allowed us to see how people lived. And you can see from the dark material in between the square house floors, that is Neolithic filth, Neolithic trash. That's the organic component rotted down. They would have been knee deep in this, these great rubbish heaps outside their doors. Archaeologists call these middens, and they preserved, well, 100,000 animal bones, I think we've got, and similar quantities of stone tools and lithic flints and flakes, as well as pottery sherds from their cooking pots. So that's an idea of how that part of the settlement might have looked. And it's really quite enormous. From the density of houses that we found and the areas that we know were occupied, I think we're looking at maybe as many as 1,000 houses. So it's a settlement, verging on the size of a town that could have accommodated somewhere around 4,000 people. And yet, surprisingly, it was very short-lived. In radiocarbon terms, we can see that it's less than 45 years. My guess is it probably wasn't much more than a decade, because we could see that each house had its own group of pits that they dug out to get suitable materials to resurface their floors and patch their walls. And in no case was there more than 12 such pits associated with each house, suggesting to me that maybe that was 12 annual refurbishments. But it's a spectacular settlement, and at the center of it are these great timber circles. This is one that we had a TV company rebuild for us temporarily. It's known as the Southern Circle, to distinguish it from the Northern Circle, also within Darrington Walls. And of course, the other great circle is Woodhenge, just outside of Darrington Walls. And these all have solstitial orientations. What was particularly interesting was that the Southern Circle had an avenue leading to it. And at the other end of the avenue, 600 feet away, it met the River Avon. And like Stonehenge's avenue, it too was on a purely natural feature, a flint surface which had accumulated at the bottom of a valley which fortuitously was aligned on the solstice, but this time on the midsummer sunset solstice in one direction and the midwinter solstice sunrise in the other. In other words, it's the opposite to the one at Stonehenge. And then when the settlement went out of use, they built a huge timber circle, which we discovered with survey and then excavation in 2016, 1,500 feet in diameter, once the settlement was in ruins. More amazingly, perhaps, is that these posts, many of which would have weighed more than a ton, they were pulled out vertically. And the only way I can think that they could possibly have done that was by putting a pair of A-frames, leaning them up from opposite sides of the post, and then pulling outwards so that the post pops up. I don't know if you've got one of those fancy bottle openers for opening bottles of wine, which is like a pair of arms, and you do that and it pulls out the cork. A similar kind of principle. And then once the posts were out, they constructed the great timber, so the great chalk ditch and bank of the henge. Now, another team, the Stonehenge Landscape team, so Stonehenge Hidden Landscape Project, have discovered that out well beyond the edges of Darrington Walls, there's another circular feature. And this is actually marked by a series of gigantic pits, up to 60 feet each one in diameter and as much as 15 feet deep. These were dug out sometime after the Henge, around 2300 BC, but they effectively demonstrate that Darrington Walls was really, it wasn't just the actual settlement, but a large area around it that was significant. And I think once we populate that particular landscape with all of the posts and features, for Neolithic people, all these timber monuments would have been, and other diggings, would have been far more impressive than the rather tiny Stonehenge, just less than 2 miles away. So it's realizing that for people's lives, this was the real focus. This is where people would have spent most time, visiting Stonehenge only very occasionally, because this is the area that's absolutely packed with Neolithic trash, whereas Stonehenge, it has very little apart from human cremated bones. But the great thing about that discovery was that after 20 years of Ramili Sonnina's theory and the speculation that there might be a domain of the living, that actually showed us precisely where its edges were. So terrific for the theory to be upheld, something we didn't believe was even likely or possible when Ramili Sonnina and I put it together in 1998. We also know that his idea of a domain of the ancestors works very well in terms of the levels of debris, the density of artifacts and other archaeological sites and remains in the Stonehenge area, that there's actually an empty zone around Stonehenge, which I've marked with a dashed blue line, an area where archaeologists have failed to find very much of any interest at all. All of the flints and other artifacts largely seem to fall outside of that area. So there was an area around Stonehenge that seems to have been kept remarkably clean. Coming back to Darrington Walls, what we have is at Darrington Walls, what we have is lots of animal bones, and 90% of them are pig, domesticated pig, and most of the remaining 10% are domesticated cattle. And my colleague Umberto Albarella and his team of faunal analysts, people who study animal bones and teeth, they've been able to show that most of the pigs, the pigs are killed, and there's a particular peak in their first autumn and winter. So that suggests to us that the feasting is most significant at Darrington Walls in the midwinter period. So for them, it looks likely that the midwinter solstice was more important than the midsummer solstice. If you like, you could call it Neolithic Christmas. We also know that they were barbecuing as well as boiling. So pigs and cows were being roasted, but also they were being chopped up and cooked in pots as well. There are virtually no human remains from Darrington Walls, in contrast to Stonehenge, just a few loose bones, but we can get an idea of where people came from where the animals originated. And it is through analyzing the isotopes in their teeth, primarily strontium, but also from other chemical elements such as oxygen and carbon and nitrogen and sulfur, that we can get an idea of where they set out from, the people bringing their animals to Darrington Walls. And for both cattle and pigs, the majority are actually likely to be non-local. We know that any animals being raised on the chalklands of England, and Stonehenge is in an area of chalk, that they have values between 0.711 and 709. And although most of our sample fall within that band, so parsimoniously you could say, well, maybe they came from the locality of Stonehenge. When we look at the combined isotopes altogether, we can see that actually very few of them come from Salisbury Plain, but most of them actually come from different areas of chalkland, which are likely to be in southern England, but also over in eastern England. And then we've got groups, animals with values over 0.711, and they come from other regions. We think most likely the area of Wales is likely to be significant. And of course, Wales is important because we know that the smaller stones at Stonehenge, the ones we call blue stones, which are just up to 3 3/4 tons maximum, they come from 180 miles away. And that's very different to the Sarsons, which are relatively local. Now, we've only just been finishing off analysis of where those Sarsons come from. And of course, they're the big ones. They form the outer circle with its lintels, and also the inner horseshoe of what are called trilithons. So that's 2 uprights and a lintel laid on top. And they form a central horseshoe of 5 trilithons. And today, the blue stones are arranged within those 2 settings. So that second stage that went up around 2500 BC, the Sarsons, we now know, thanks to a team of geologists led by David Nash, they come from 15 miles to the north, not quite as far as the Marlborough Downs, where right from the days of Aubrey and Stukely, it was thought that they came from. But 15 miles, when you're pulling stones that generally weigh 20 tons, that's no mean feat. And to do that, we realized that you can't use rollers. They'd simply just get dug into the ground. You've actually got to knock up some kind of almost like a wooden railway so that you pull them with timbers laid in the direction that you're heading. And we think it's more likely that they probably avoided water, that actually you want to stick to the dry ground to pull them. So we've got a suggested route in this map here. Now that accounts for all but 2 of the Sarsons. Those other 2 we can't locate. It's the blue stones, though, that I find most fascinating, because they have come an enormous distance, at least in UK terms. For us, 180 miles is a very, very long way indeed. And that takes us all the way to the west coast of Britain, to the area that we call Pembrokeshire today. And although geologists have known for about 100 years that these blue stones are different types of rock, some of them, well, most of them are igneous, but some are sedimentary, sandstone. We've given them the term bluestone really as a kind of catch-all. It's not a proper geological term. It's just really the name for the foreign stones at Stonehenge. And most of them, you can see, is this marked in dark blue. This is a type of dolerite, an igneous rock, which has little white spots in it. So it's called spotted dolerite. But there's also 3 other stones that are unspotted dolerite. And dolerite it's a solidified magma, and it has this really kind of greeny blue color to it. And then there are various less frequent types of rhyolite. It's a sheet lava, solidified. And then there are what the geologists are calling volcanics. These are actually layers of sedimentary clay into which volcanic ash has fallen in some kind of half a billion-year-old pyroclastic flow for those volcanologists amongst us. And then there are a few others of sandstone, the most well-known of which is the altar stone. And that's the only one that doesn't come from West Wales. That we now think comes from South Wales. So it's about 50 miles, 60 miles this side of the Preseli Mountains, where the rest of the bluestones come from. Now, what was really exciting was working with brilliant geologists, Richard Bevins and Rob Ixer. Richard's a geochemist and Rob is a petrographer. So Richard looks at the chemistry and Rob looks at the physical microscopic characteristics of the rock. Between them, they've located sources for 3 of the types of rock at Stonehenge and a broad area for the sandstones. And it was in 2010 that the first of their identifications of one of the rhyolites at Stonehenge, marked on this plan here with the red dot, that they worked out exactly where it was. And then a few years later, they worked out where one of the spotted dolerite sources was. So the rhyolite, they identified not up on the mountain, but actually in one of the valleys on the north side, a site called Craigrosavalen. We think that probably no more than 1 pillar at Stonehenge came from this particular outcrop. But the great thing was that Rob was able to work out exactly where on the outcrop it came from, marked by that red arrow, because he, by looking at the microscopic structure of the rock, could see that all the way around that outcrop, it was different. But where it conformed, where it matched with the debris that he'd been looking at microscopically at Stonehenge, there was only one location. And we could see that there was actually the gap, the recess where a pillar 12 foot long had been removed. And then we also discovered that in the rock, in the jointing behind it, still in place, were actual wedges of stone that had been hammered in to try and open up the joints. They'd been trying to get out more rocks, more pillars, because of course you can see how beautifully this solidified lava, this rhyolite, has actually formed natural pillars. So all you've got to do is get into the joints, expand them, and then you can just pull them off. It's, as you know, suggested, it's kind of like one of these DIY stores for Neolithic megalith builders. You just turn up and say, I'm going to have that one, knock in a few stone wedges, get some ropes out, and pull away the stone. So we also found that there were other features. We found that there was a trackway leading from an artificial platform at the foot of the outcrop that they'd obviously pulled the stone along. And we could get some radiocarbon dates to see that the quarrying had taken place sometime around 3400 BC. So quite a bit earlier than Stonehenge. At Carn Goedog, up on the northern flanks of the Preseli Mountains, we carried out another excavation and we found lots more evidence of quarrying. And in this case, the radiocarbon dates showed that it extended over a longer period of time, potentially as much as 400 years. And these are the main source of the stones now at Stonehenge. And you can see again that the way that the magma had cooled to form this spotted dolerite, you can see that it formed these natural pillars that all you have to do is to prise them off. Now you can see on the map here, Craigrosavalen, Carn Goedog, and another of the sources for the unspotted dolerite. And we know that this area in West Wales was an important Neolithic centre of population. The black squares are Neolithic tombs. and they're also marked with black circles. There are Neolithic enclosures. So this was a major ceremonial complex, not just where people lived, but also where they built impressive funerary monuments, as well as big enclosures in which to gather for large ceremonies. But what particularly attracted us, and where we started investigating in 2017, was a site called Mound, because it was here in the middle of this ceremonial, well, in the middle of this Neolithic zone, there was an arc of 4 standing stones. 3 of them had fallen over. Just one of them was still standing, just in the middle top of the picture. And I don't know if you can see all 4 stones. There's one over by our spoil heaps in the top left. And archaeologists even 100 years ago had noticed these and suggested that maybe these had once formed part of a stone circle. But nobody did any more to actually find out if that was true. If they were, where had all the other stones gone and when had they been taken away? So we started excavating in 2017, then we did a major season in 2018. We've had to have a break for the last 2 years, but that's enabled us to get all the dating and all the other scientific analyses done. So what we discovered was that those 4 stones, and I've marked them as black and red circles in the top of the picture here, they were augmented by another at least 6 stone holes that we found in our excavations marked in green. And we're pretty sure that this is only a handful of what was once there, because these were holes that had originally held blue stones. One of them, the one in the photograph, actually had chippings from the stone that had stood in it. And we could see that this was a huge stone circle, 110 meters diameter, which makes it the 3rd largest in the whole of Britain. And we were able to date it, radiocarbon dating of charcoal, but also a technique called optically stimulated luminescence. And that's where you collect samples in which there are grains of quartz, but you have to be careful not to expose those to the light, because what happens is that you can then fire a laser in infrared conditions at grains of quartz, which releases the energy since they were last exposed to light. You can measure that release, and then you can work out how long ago that happened. And using both these techniques together, we were able to date the circle to a period somewhere between 3,400 and 3,200 BC. So that makes it among the earliest stone circles in Britain. Very possibly it was the first one. It may have been the original stone circle, first of them all. I wonder whether, of course, the stone that came from Craigrosavalen, the rhyolite, maybe that was first put up here around 3,400 or shortly after, and then taken down. We can't be absolutely sure about the date of removal, because it's impossible to date an absence, because once the stone is pulled out, that leaves a hole, and you can't date a hole. All you can do is date the sediment that accumulated in the hole. And of course, that could be centuries or even thousands of years later. The dates we have of that sediment shows that the stones were pulled out before 2000 BC, so before the Bronze Age, most likely. And that suggests to me that we're looking at removal in prehistory, and I would suggest most likely around 3000 BC, because these were the stones that went to Stonehenge. One of them that produced chippings. Here's one of those chippings. We could see from the shape of it that it was very similar to one of the cross sections of the stones at Stonehenge, Stone 62. There's a photograph of that stone in situ, and it's also one of the few types that is unspotted dolerite. And Stone 62 at Stonehenge is itself one of the three unspotted dolerites. So very possibly we actually have the hole that stone initially stood in. We found other intriguing comparisons. First of all, there was a solstice alignment at Mound. We had two stones or stone holes, one of the stones still there, that had formed a kind of gun sight arrangement looking towards midsummer solstice. But also, when we overlaid the two plans, we could see that the circle at Mound was exactly the same diameter as the ditch of Stonehenge. And to my knowledge, they're the only two Neolithic monuments that share that diameter. Archaeologists have wondered for a long time about how you get probably 80 of these blue stones all the way from West Wales to Stonehenge. And for much of the 20th century, the thinking was that they came south to the sea at Milford Haven, and then were carried on boats or rafts along the South Welsh coast, and then across the Severn Estuary to what is now Bristol, and up the other river Avon in southern England, the Bristol Avon, and then ultimately the last bit by land. We suspect, though, that actually, given that the quarries and the Mound Circle are on the north side of the Preseli Mountains, that rather than cross the mountains, it might have made more sense to go by land. And from my own study of megaliths in Madagascar and other archaeologists and anthropologists looking at contemporary megalith building around the world, you don't take risks of the sort by going by sea if you can avoid it. The other thing that we've learned from looking at the way people pull megaliths today is that you call on huge numbers of people to take part. And in fact, you have no trouble getting volunteers, because if you've got a suitable feast to be held at various points, then you'll have no trouble with the thousands of people turning up. So my guess is that the landward route would be more likely. And of course, the location of the altar stone is likely to be halfway along that route in the area that is north of Cardiff today. So why did they do it? Because it's a crazy thing to do. It's hard enough to have done it in the first place. So the how is itself quite remarkable, but the why is perhaps more intriguing. And one of the possibilities is that it could be that the stones were brought by people living in Preseli. The other possibility is that they were taken by conquest by people from Salisbury Plain who wanted to have those monuments and were prepared to go and take them down. Now, despite either of those, a third possibility is that whether it involved migration or conquest, it could equally have been an act of unification to bring together two very separate communities within Neolithic Britain. We've got some clues about who brought the stones from the isotope analysis of the first people to be buried at Stonehenge. When we conducted strontium isotope analysis on a sample of 25 individuals, and we found that whilst 10 of those had grown up and been living beyond Salisbury Plain, 4 of those had actually come from somewhere much further away, that their strontium values were consistent with living in West Wales. And what was interesting is from the whole 600 years of the cemetery, these 4 dated to its very beginnings. So these must have been alive around the time that the bluestones came to Stonehenge. Quite possibly, these were actually some of the people that brought the bluestones to Stonehenge. So that suggests to me that the evidence, such as it is in favor of people bringing the stones themselves, rather than this being an act of conquest. What more do we know about these people and their ancestry, their origins, who they were? And we've had remarkable developments in analyzing ancient DNA, literally in the last 5 years. And we now know that the Neolithic population of Britain completely displaced the hunter-gatherer populations that were living in Britain and Ireland, and that these farmers had come originally from the Middle East and Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, all the way through the Mediterranean, and then from the Western Mediterranean up into Britain to arrive there somewhere around 6,000 years ago. Now, there were 2 groups that came across Europe. The other lot came up the Danube, basically, and into northern Germany and southern Scandinavia. Yes, we now know that the British population of Neolithic farmers was most closely related to those in Spain and Portugal. What's also interesting is that despite coming from that southern route, we can see that they're not all the same, that the Neolithic farmers in Ireland, as well as in Western Britain, so including Wales, they have a slightly different genetic mix to those from Eastern England and Scotland. You can see the color coding in the map there on the left. That ties in very nicely with the archaeological evidence that suggests 2 broad routes of migration to Britain by these earliest farmers. One lot coming from the area of northwest France, the area we call Brittany, up the North Sea, touching land in West Wales first, the area where the bluestones come from, and then further up into the Irish Sea. And a second group coming from northern France on the shorter, more straightforward Calais to Dover route. So we have a regionalism in those early Neolithic populations, and that makes me wonder whether Stonehenge was built because it was all to do with creating unity between what had been 2 different ancestries in terms of these Neolithic farmers. And so I wonder that if the stones were brought by the people of the Preseli Mountains, maybe it was part of a unification. Stonehenge, interestingly, lies in an area that used to be of different pottery styles, different tomb styles. And I just wonder whether what we're looking at is that Stonehenge was built as a monument to unify the ancestors of these different communities in Britain, and that the location there, with its particular natural landform, the periglacial fissures, maybe they saw that as an axis mundi, an axis in a center of the earth, as a kind of key point where the different communities could come together. And then what about the rebuilding of Stonehenge in its second stage, when the massive Great Sarsons came in? Because around 2500, something very interesting was happening in mainland Europe, which was the culmination of what seemed to be a series of quite massive movements of groups coming out of the area known as the Pontic Steppe, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and that these groups were integrating with the Neolithic farmers as they moved across Europe. And then we find them arriving in Britain, or at least we see evidence for their burials. These are the people we call the beaker people, because of the characteristic beaker pots that they put in those burials. And they're very different to the Neolithic farmers within Britain. And interestingly enough, it took something like 16 generations for them to assimilate. And even then, the population derived 90% of its genes from these beaker people and only 10% from the Neolithic farmers who had been their ancestors in Britain. So it's quite a population transformation, population replacement, as well as a major cultural change. And I wonder whether shortly before their full arrival in Britain, whether there was a contact period in which that sense of unity was seen as under threat, and that Stonehenge was built in its grandest form to attempt to construct a unity at the very moment before it was all to fall apart. And finally, one of the questions as archaeologists we often ask is, what sorts of conditions do you need to build a great monument like Stonehenge? And I'd always thought that you'd expect it to be economic boom time, that you need a really big growing population because you've got to have lots of people to pull on all those ropes. You've got to maximize your surplus, so producing vast quantities of cereal and meat to feed everybody, and also to have lots of long distance links for trade and exchange, reaching out not just around the locality, but across the ocean, across the English Channel, for example. But what's quite interesting is the reality seems to have been very different. Currently, the evidence suggests that there were actually fewer sites after 3400 BC, a smaller population. The evidence from pollen shows that actually forests were growing back in this period, that the advances that Neolithic farmers had made in clearing forest for fields were actually being turned around. Similarly, we see declines in the cultivation of barley and wheat, their two cereals. And just to cap it all, they seem to have cut off their contacts with mainland Europe. We see from 3400 BC, the whole Stonehenge period, one of cultural isolation, which didn't end until those beaker people turned up shortly after 2500 BC. So it's been quite an interesting voyage of discovery. And maybe that was the whole point, that in a society that was shrinking, that people were becoming more decentralized and really having to rely on each other in more dispersed and disparate settlements, that this is where building a monument becomes so important in an attempt to actually pull people together, to hold communities together, to build a sense of community that may have been disappearing. So perhaps we need to think about monument building in a rather different way. Anyway, I'm sure I've gone on for far too long, so I'll stop there and hand us back to Jose. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. We have gone a little over time, but we have gotten some excellent questions in the chat. So if that's okay with you, I would say let's try and tackle some of these
Sure.
questions.
Certainly.
We've gotten lots of questions around the geological feature that you find at Stonehenge and Darrington Walls. And some of the questions are around what might these have looked like at the time, and how would Neolithic peoples have recognized these features?
Yeah.
Would they have to have been eagle-eyed, or would have they been very
Right.
obvious?
Yeah. Yes, I've talked to our geoarchaeologists about this, and they're archaeologists who specifically look at natural landforms. And what they say is that you've got to remember that well, first of all, Salisbury Plain never got fully forested like other parts of Britain after the Ice Age. That these high chalklands had only very limited forest cover, so largely grassland. And of course, that would have been one of the reasons that it was a very attractive location also for hunter-gatherers before the farmers. But in those situations, first of all, you haven't had the 6,000 years of erosion and weathering, which of course has made the feature in terms of an earthwork less impressive, but also there were much thinner soils. So looking at this period that we call the early Holocene, the soils are really only just starting to form after the retreat of the ice and the tundra-like conditions. So they say, first of all, you would actually, with grass cover, all you need is a dry summer to be able to see the parching effects, that they would actually look like stripes of different varieties of green. And of course, you would have the two ridges being really quite prominent. So they would have seen it both as an earthwork and as a stripy thing in the grass.
Much more noticeable than it is to our modern eyes.
Yeah.
And then to build on that question, you had talked about that potentially first stone circle, which is of almost an identical size in Wales. Do we see a similar geological feature at that site as well?
No, not so far as we know. What we do have is that's one of the earliest monuments that has a solstice orientation, and it's around the same time that 3,400, 3,200, that we have the other solstice aligned monuments in Britain and Ireland being constructed. So in Ireland, there is Newgrange, where the sun shines down the passage on midwinter's morning. You've got a similar arrangement in the islands of Orkney off the north coast of Scotland, at Maes Howe, where it's midwinter's evening that the sun shines down the passage. And there's another one of these passage tombs on the island of Anglesey in North Wales. But in that case, it's the midsummer solstice sun that shines down there. But I think what's interesting is it's particularly this association with the dead, with the ancestors, that we see this special solstitial kind of alignment in their monuments, whether it's the passage tombs or the stone circles.
And speaking on this sort of realm of the dead versus realm of the living idea, what do the remains at Stonehenge tell us about the status or the lives of those individuals?
Yeah. They had very few grave goods that they put with the cremated bones. There's one very nice stone mace head, and that suggests that that's not going to be the equipment of everybody, so that there may well have been people of an elevated status. I think the most interesting thing is the fact that at Stonehenge and more widely, you've got this association with women being buried at these monuments. I don't think we're necessarily talking about a matriarchy. I think it may well be that, yes, we're seeing a period where women were more valued. One suggestion has been that in a kind of pastoralist society like this, women are really important because, of course, they are the bearers of fertility, and their status is it reflects that to a much greater extent. If we're looking at a period of population decline, possibly that fertility, female power is something that is really considered very important in that society.
And is there any evidence of ritualized sacrifice, either animal or human, at the site?
Not at Stonehenge, no. And Victorian ideas about Stonehenge. One of the stones is called the slaughter stone, and it was thought that animals might have been slaughtered there. No, we're seeing what seems to be a population that are going through what are effectively the normal mortuary rites, that it is cremation and burial. And in most of these cases, these are token burials. In fact, very much like today in Britain, what we do is cremation is the most regular rite today. 75% of the population are cremated. And quite often people will take a portion of the ashes and scatter them in one place, deposit them in another place. And it may be to do with personal associations. But we're seeing something like, very similar to that, at least, happening in the Neolithic, in this part of the Neolithic, because it's just a part of the body that is comprising the ashes in most cases with Neolithic cremations. So we call them partial or token. And that suggests that people are being distributed in different parts of the landscape. So that's not going to be the result of sacrifices. Yeah. I think we can be sure these are burials for people whose time came not cut short by being sacrificially murdered.
Well, thank goodness for that.
Yeah, not that it didn't go on, I'm sure.
And then just a final question about the settlement at Darrington Walls. Was it typical for Neolithic peoples of this period to keep their rubbish so close to their house? And if so, why do we think this settlement was so short-lived?
Yeah. Yes, where we do get well-preserved sites, and you'd have to go to somewhere like the islands of Orkney off the north coast of Scotland, basically treeless islands by that point. So they were building their houses very usefully for us in stone. And their settlements are actually sort of set into great heaps of rubbish. Partly it's good for insulation, but elsewhere, yes, we do find these great spreads of midden. I don't think it's too extraordinary to live amongst your rubbish. I mean, you can look around many parts of the world today and see that probably many millions of people are living surrounded by vast heaps of garbage. The second part of the question was about Darrington Walls and being short-lived. Now, I think basically it's there because it's the builder's camp. The settlement is there to get all the people to construct Stonehenge. And I think what's really been intriguing is that we've scoured that landscape around Stonehenge itself to see, well, are there other big settlements from that period? And nothing is really coming up. So it really looks like they were commuting to work. It's 1 3/4 miles between the two. But I think that's about, that's making the point about how the two realms of the supernatural and the living had to be kept apart. And it's a pattern that we're finding not just at Stonehenge, but in other ceremonial landscapes of the same period, right through Britain, into Wales, into Scotland, and also across the sea into Ireland. So it seems to be part of the settlement pattern of these big complexes, where you separate the two domains, is something that is much more widespread than at Stonehenge itself.
Interesting. It did not occur to me that you would want to commute to work, but we all do it so much. And then, of course, Yes, and people living near garbage, I'm sure will be good fodder for future archaeologists.
Exactly. Yes.
And then, of course, probably as modern people, we think of rubbish differently than the type of things that our Neolithic ancestors were dealing with. I mean, probably didn't have a lot of single-use plastics back then.
No.
I guess.
One of the things that anthropologists have pointed out is that in some cultures, your rubbish is the sign of your wealth and status, because it shows how much feasting you've been hosting. It shows that the kind of resources you can draw upon. So if you've got a huge, great rubbish heap, that's a kind of demonstration of what a good host you are.
I'd imagine. I would imagine. Well, Dr. Parker Pearson, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And also thank you so much for answering those questions and just spending some time with us today. I am very appreciative of your time. And I'm sure I speak for everyone who attended as well. And for those of you out there who did attend, we did our best to answer your questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have more questions, please come visit the temporary exhibition, Stonehenge, Ancient Mysteries and Modern Discoveries, at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. It will be there through September 6th. I posted a link in the chat, and that will take you to a place where you can get tickets and more information. Dr. Parker Pearson, thank you again. I really appreciate it. It's been a sincere pleasure. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I hope everybody out there has a good rest of their day as well. Thank you, everybody.
Many thanks, Jose. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. Thank you. Cheers.
Indeed. Bye. Goodbye, everyone. Bye.